Well, thank you, and it's my pleasure to be back at Stanford. Actually, what that didn't mention is when I was asked at one point to become a corporate CEO, and I had been basically a Chinese-speaking human rights lawyer, I told my board chair at the time, who was a guy you guys have probably heard of, a guy named Bill Gates. I said, you know, I don't even know what a P&L is. And so he said, well, maybe you should go down to Stanford for a month and take one of those mini MBAs. So I actually did that. And so I had a wonderful summer month on campus when it was really sunny out the whole time. So it's fun to be back here at Stanford, as well as over the years have done quite a few projects here, including helping think about the seed project at GSB as part of my role at McKinsey a couple years ago. So I was given clear instructions that this is a kind of a conversation, which I really like, rather than me speaking and lecturing, which I also do a lot of. And I thought I would do a few minutes just on who I am, because I understand that that's partly the idea here. Well, how did I get to be doing what I'm doing, and why, and if there are any themes or drivers that I can even navigate or imagine. And then talk a little bit about the work that we're doing, we mean the organization I now lead, which is actually deeply enmeshed into this world of social innovation, social entrepreneurship, and how do you partner. Really, our biggest theme is cross-sector collaboration in order to solve the 21st century's biggest problems. So I'll spend a little bit of time on that, but I'll try to leave most of the time just to talk in Q&A. I was trying to prove my son, actually. I have a son who's a little younger than most of you guys, and he's in the Bay Area this weekend looking at schools. We're in the senior year. We finished his college essay last night. So yesterday we were in San Francisco, and we had a moment where we took some Segways out, and we were pretending like I was 13 again, and we were racing through doing slalom racing, and I fell really badly. So if I start hopping, it's because I have way too much Advil in me. Because when you get to be my age, you'll realize that you shouldn't pretend anymore. But anyway. So who am I, and why am I here in front of y'all at Stanford? Well, I'm one of these people that you would never want to take career advice from. My parents, for years, kept asking me if I was ever going to figure out what I wanted to do, and my answer was repeatedly no, and I didn't understand the point. My trajectory has been anything but on the straight and narrow. Just a quick summary and a more thematically than specifics, but I did end up coming out of undergraduate without any sense of what I wanted to do, other than I had a religion and philosophy degree from Princeton and knew I didn't want to become a minister or a teacher. So I ended up in Asia, where I was on a fellowship and taught and learned Chinese, and that was something that stuck, and throughout most of my life I've worked in things related to Asia and China. But I also then meandered to the law, focusing a lot of Chinese law and human rights law for many years. Ended up, for a variety of reasons, primarily to do with things going on in China in the late 1980s, as well as sort of getting a little bit of burnout doing human rights work, is that I ended up going and taking my law degree, and we moved back across from New York to Seattle, where we had family, and ended up starting to just sort of pay off the law school loans and doing a lot of public interest law at a big law firm. And it turned out it was the law firm that Bill Gates' dad merged his firm with. So there was a bit of a serendipitous opportunity to say, well, I actually think I was doing a lot of intellectual property law, in that context. And so suddenly I found myself working on a lot of interesting projects around China and Chinese intellectual property, also around the nascent software industry, which was very nascent back then. And then one thing led to another, and I ended up joining and starting an internet company with Bill, and building it over about a 15-year period from scratch. When I first helped, when we first got together and started thinking about it, we were still talking about the information superhighway, because we actually started this company before anybody knew or used the word internet. And it was really hard to explain what this information superhighway was to potential investors and partners. But anyway, it evolved fine, and the company still exists. At some point, told work, I came out of social sector approaches. I wanted to continue my commitment to civic and community affairs. And so that even though I was busily running and growing a global business, I wanted to make sure I kept that part of my connection with the world. So I actually did a number of things. I ended up chairing the local United Way, because I'd come in and helped try to, I can tell you that story later, but I made a really smart-ass comment to somebody, and the next thing I knew, and it happened to be Bill's father, I didn't realize he was like a big United Way guy, and the next thing I knew, I was chairing the United Way board. But then I also helped start several nonprofits over the years, some of which we scaled to national organizations, InPower being one of them, that I was on the founding board of, and then we've taken it to a national organization. And then a number of other things like that, including being asked to serve on the board of PATH because of my understanding of intellectual property and how it matched with this emerging global health world. And I wouldn't have guessed back then when I was asked to be on the board that at some point I'd be the CEO, but, and it wasn't at all in my trajectory. But in the meantime, I did that and got to know global health and development pretty well. And then at some point after I'd left my company and was teaching and sitting on a lot of boards, corporate and nonprofit, I was asked to, by McKinsey, if I'd be interested in helping them with their social sector. So then I spent 4 years at McKinsey, and I ended up being the director of global social innovation there. So it was a great run, getting to work on really important and interesting, tough projects and problems, and bringing together really interesting people to try to create a tri-sector approach to solving some of these big problems. And that I did until last year when I decided to do this job. So that was like the first sort of, okay, my run through my life. Now let me tell you the more interesting themes there to give you a better flavor of what drives me and why I do this work. So I've been really lucky, I think, to be part of four, I think, of arcs or four things that have happened so far in the world that I just, I've been part of, I've actually been very engaged in, and they've happened to sort of correspond with my time on Earth. The first is I'm a gay man who came out in 1980 after being raised on a ranch in Montana, where, trust me, in the 1970s and 60s, that wasn't a lot of fun. So that's informed my perspective on the world a lot, partly because I would have never guessed that, now I am a married man with a partner of 33 years and a 17-year-old son, that when I was growing up, that was unimaginable, to be honest. And so being part of that journey, and actually not only the personal journey there, and the struggle that creates, but also I got very involved in the politics of this. So I was also a gay man in the 1980s during the AIDS crisis in New York and buried a lot of my friends. I also then became very active in human and civil rights around this issue, both around the HIV issue and around gay and lesbian rights. In fact, I was on the national board of Lambda Legal Defense, which is the main legal group that was working on these issues and still is. And so that work was phenomenal in many ways. I mean, it was really hard, and it was a sense of oppression that was very, very acute, and people were dying and being jailed, and suicide rates very high. And how do you make and strategize? So I was one of those people that was like the strategy guy, right? That was sat down with a lot of leaders around the country, and how do we map out a way forward? And so mapping out a litigation strategy, mapping out a political strategy, mapping out, and is marriage going to be important, or is it employment, or is it, sodomy, or what are the ones that we had to go and fight? We had to fight all of them, but what were the order? And so that, it was a really extraordinary journey, and it remains that way, up until last year, where I was part of the, part of the group that we got marriage passed for the first time by voters in Washington. And so, but anyway, that's a theme that I've been very privileged to be part of, to see that social change happen. And it's not easy, and it's sometimes uncomfortable, and it takes a lot of hard work, and you have as many setbacks as you have victories. In fact, probably in that journey you have more so far, but overall, history's on our side, and now we have to look to a lot of increase, and we still have to. There's still a lot of struggle there that we have to work on. So that's actually been an arc and a theme that informs my sense of equity and justice. It's been useful to bring some perspective. I don't talk about it very often in my work, but it brings us some perspective of understanding how you don't always have the chits on your side of the table, and you have to think about that in a thoughtful way, and understand that people can be disenfranchised for just being who they are, and that's important in the work we do. The second theme that's been fascinating in my life is China. So I actually went out to China in 1979. And I got off the airplane, and the security guy came up to me, and I showed him I had a visa, and he said "Ni hao," which is hello in China. And I looked at him like, what are you talking about? And I didn't even know how to say hello in Chinese. I remember I was a Montana farm boy. So it's also been an extraordinary part of my journey, which means that I got to understand and live in a culture that was as extremely foreign. I lived in a rural area. Taught at a university, learned Chinese the hard way, ate everything imaginable, and went back and eventually got multiple degrees in Chinese studies. Did my law degree actually on the death penalty in China, and I did most of it in Chinese. And so it was really, it again has been an extraordinary part of of my life. A place I love, a place that's super complex, a place that has gone from when I was first engaged, it was right at the end of the Cultural Revolution. I was part of the first group of foreign graduate students to be at Beijing University after the Cultural Revolution, where there's about 20 of us and the North Koreans eating cabbage 3 times a day, and it was a real intense experience to. Now I go back to China quite often. A lot of the McKinsey work I did, I actually had Beijing on my business card because I was doing so much in China to help engage on social resources for global health and development from China. So it's been incredible to watch this country that emerge as a global superpower. Still lots of challenges and struggles, and a lot of poverty and health and other things that we should care about. But also a lot of innovation, a lot of resources, a lot of opportunities. So I'm very excited about the opportunities that China, being more part of the fabric of the world, is going to create for all of us in this century. I also my son is from China, so he's adopted from China. So there's even a full circle to that story. The third piece of my life, which I actually also feel very privileged and lucky to be part of, was the internet. So again, I got involved in this back in the late 80s when it was just kind of, we were doing desktop publishing was about as advanced as it was gotten, and tried to figure out what this was going to mean to the world, to bring together this power of digital, which we kind of vaguely understood as, and I remember we described it as 2-way packets of data that would move back and forth. I mean, it was that simple of a way of framing it, to thinking, well, how do you marry it? In my instance, what I got involved in was the world of digital media. So we were thinking about photography and video, and what would it mean to put photography online and video online. And let me tell you, it was heretical at the time. I mean, I remember arguing it, with the director of the Museum of Modern Art in a meeting one time where, I was, the Antichrist. Because I was thinking of, exploiting art in this sort of technology way, and video would never be quality, et cetera. So it was quite a journey as well, because we had to figure out, what were the tools, what was the business proposition, what was the opportunity, what should be the ethical and social rules. I mean, not that we were going to figure that out and dictate it, but to understand that this was all going to emerge, and how do you maneuver and navigate. And now, I no longer do a lot as much as I used to in that area. I've sat on a number of boards, and certainly digital health is probably the biggest thing I think about at PATH every day in terms of where we're going and what it'll mean for us, for saving lives around the world. But it's extraordinary, right? When I think of, I actually helped edit Bill Gates' first book, and when I think of, we looked at the road ahead, it was called, back in I don't know what years, but I mean, I think of that now and how naive we were. Maybe a bit prescient that we understood that this was really powerful, but really completely naive about what it would mean and what turns it would take. The concept of crowdsourcing was beyond us. The concept of really social media was beyond anybody at that point. I mean, even thinking of digital as more than just a platform to do what you did in your analog life was pretty much how we thought about it. And so that's been actually quite informative too for my thinking around global health and social entrepreneurship, because I think one of the things there you learn is you do reach tipping points, and as much as that's probably an overused expression, but you start thinking you're on a path, and all at once it suddenly moves to something other than what you ever thought, and you suddenly are on a different path. And it's not that it's utterly nonlinear. There are some aspects that are quite linear, but it just takes a quantum leap at different points. And I didn't trust that, and I probably trust that. That will happen, and I think it will continue to happen in areas that you all are working on, that you'll suddenly hit a moment and you'll go, wow, we're playing a totally different ballgame. And I think that's really cool. So in the last part, and to connect it with the more substantive part of the conversation is, I think now I'm actually either privileged to be part of another arc, if you will, or maybe it's just more the payback starts happening, where you can apply some of this learning and wisdom and figure out what's next. But I'm now very deeply engaged in the world of global health and development, running one of the largest NGOs in the world, and very involved in the evolution and the conversation about where civil society is going to take us in the 21st century. Both on the ground, as I've worked deeply with civil society players in places in Western China or rural Mozambique or Ethiopia. I'm heading off in a couple days to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and at places like Davos and Dalian, where I'm actually the vice chair of the Civil Society Forum at the World Economic Forum. So it's a very interesting new journey to be on. Not so new. I mean, I've been involved in it for quite a while, but because I think it's really another potentially transformative time, where, as represented by you all in this room and this topic, is that we're thinking about some of these big problems that we've always had. I mean, poverty and bad health. I mean, maybe we didn't realize we had problems around climate, but we have for a long time as it's evolved. Challenges around education. I mean, these fundamental life and human problems that we tackle, we really have opportunities to use new tools and to approach them differently. And I think we're going through that transformation right now, and I think you're part of it. I hope I can play a little bit of a part of it through some of this work. So, some of that is just, the block and tackle of doing stuff that matters, and I will go through some of the stuff we do that matters. Some of it is, a set of engagement models that, how do we, I'm a big believer, I actually don't believe that social entrepreneurship is holy or sacred or going to change the world in and of itself. I think it's a great thing that people are interested in social entrepreneurship. I think it's way overblown, that we still need businesses to do their part, we need nonprofits to do their part, we need, there's a fundamental role for these various actors, and that we got to get right how they mix together and blend. What I do believe is that most of our biggest challenges are only going to get solved by deep, deep, authentic, multi-sector collaboration. And that's where I think, that's where I think the experiences of social entrepreneurism is really important, because many social enterprises are working across the cusp of social and for-profit. But I don't think I think what's the most important part of that is that we understand these various drivers and incentives and opportunities for collaboration, less so that one's more holy than the other. And so, or better or worse. I mean, they all have huge value and merit. They also all have their problems. So we've got to figure out how to balance that. So now it might be useful to just tell you what I do and who is this PATH. It's one of the world's worst understood and most organizations in the world, because we've, up until, we were about a 37, 38-year-old organization, literally in one of the larger NGOs in the world, and until about 4 or 5 years ago, never spent a cent on marketing. As a result, nobody knows who we are, and we have to change that in order to be more visible and at the right tables. But it's an interesting challenge. I actually was with one of the director generals of the WHO, the World Health Organization, the other day, and she was saying, "Oh, PATH, it's the most important partner and most important technical, partner and NGO we work with, and we love you, and da-da-da," and she said, and I said, "Well, that's really nice, and part of me is thinking, yeah, how many times a day do you say that to people?" But then she said, I said, "Well, why is that?" And she said, "Because you do all these amazing things and you take no credit." And I'm thinking, oh, the marketer in me thinks we need people to know what we do. So that's my job, to tell you a little bit about what we do. So, PATH started about 37, 38 years ago, and it was just the classic, 3 or 4 smart people saying, there's a problem to solve. Let's get together and solve it. These people at the time were people that focused on, in the 70s, on family planning and reproductive health, and they were looking at how family planning was such a critical issue, but the quality of products and tools that people were able to use was so poor. So they started thinking about how do we improve the quality of condoms and other devices, and that's grown. But they did it with a perspective that it was about achieving better equity. And so really at its core, PATH, while it's a very complicated, fundamentally a big technology organization, is a social justice organization at its core, because what it is about is addressing inequity. We are very focused on how do we bridge, how do we narrow the inequity in health, and particularly in the poorest places in the world. And why do we care? Well, because we know health inequity drives poverty and vice versa. There is a high level of correspondence between the two. We have also better data now that if you look at what keeps people at the bottom of the pyramid and that in fact there's not that many people that are consistently in poverty. What happens a lot at the base of the pyramid is people move in and out of poverty. And this is being understood better. So what we need to do is keep those cycles from occurring. And the number one reason people move back into poverty is a health event. So a health event turns a family that's beginning to inch their way into self-sufficiency back into bad shape. And so if we can reduce those health inequities, if we can get tools and innovations and services to people to keep better health, it's not only good for those people, clearly, and there's a moral imperative, but it's also better to drive economic development, stable health systems, stable economies, and there's so much evidence. So we're focused on that problem. and we have for about 40 years, but our focus is how do we innovate? We're not, let's go do frontline clinics, we don't adopt kids, we don't have a basic research lab. We're about how to advance innovations to solve that problem. So let me tell you a good example of what we do. This is the kind of world that you all and we all live in today, and this is a way that you think of the world, that we mostly think of the world. This is the world that Pat thinks about. This is, where children die from preventable diseases. And in our world, this is unacceptable. First of all, not only is it unacceptable because of the, as I was saying, the pure human and moral dimensions of this map, but it's unacceptable because you'll see these are also some of the places where we have the highest amount of political instability. These are also places where we have other, are fractious in other ways. So this is not, there are people driven by different incentives to come to do this work. It is not only a let's help save kids' lives, which I think is a pretty cool thing to do, but it's really driven, and we get funded by people because of the larger dimensions. So let me give you an example of a problem. This is one of many. We have about 200 technologies in our pipeline, but this is the kind of problem that we look to solve. In the sub-Saharan Africa, there's a belt called the meningitis belt. It's sort of right where that circle is. It kind of goes from Senegal over on the left part of West Africa to Kenya and Ethiopia and Somalia over on the right. And it's a disease that rolls through this part of Africa every year. And it comes after the after the dry season, and it actually is devastating. Not only does it kill a lot, but it more sort of tragically, or as tragic, can't be, I guess, more tragic, but as tragically, it leaves a lot of kids particularly very severely neurologically damaged. So even if you don't die, it usually means you're very disabled for the rest of your life. And in these settings, some of the poorest settings in the world, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, these are settings where that means your family is therefore also implicated in that cycle of poverty. And generally the health systems are just they're weak or limited anyway, and then this overburdens the health systems. And then it just has this compounding effect of what it means for national and global stability. So this is not a problem that we should ignore. It's also tragic because my kids, guarantee none of your kids will likely die of meningitis. We have ways of preventing this. And one of the things that we worry about a lot is it's one thing to say, how do we keep somebody from getting HIV, where we know there's a bunch of tools and ways to do that, but we actually yet have developed a vaccine to prevent this. So, the ultimate preventative mechanism in health is a vaccine. It's the cheapest, most effective way to stop, if it's possible, using a vaccine. But there are, unfortunately, diseases like malaria and HIV. We're working. PATH is very hard on a malaria vaccine, but we don't have it. It's another thing when we have the vaccine. When rich people or middle-class people get to use that vaccine, but poor people don't. And so the problem is we have what is generally just seen as a market failure. The market has created zero incentive to make the level of investment, to do the kind of research that's needed in order to create a vaccine for the particular strain of meningitis that occurs in this district. So we looked at that problem and said, 10, 12 years ago, said, that's not right, it's not good, and we got to fix it, and we can. So we directed and drove this by pulling together a significant donor, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in this instance, worked very closely with the World Health Organization that had a mandate to help think this through. And then we started working on a bunch of challenging problems. First of all, the science. There was a vaccine, a meningitis vaccine available, but it wasn't quite right for this particular strain. So we had to get a patented, science from a Dutch organization, used a new formulation technology that came through the FDA, actually. We then found a Indian manufacturer, the Serum Institute in Pune, who could do some of the manufacturing. And actually, most importantly, in those early planning stages, and let's not forget this lesson, particularly as we think we have all the answers here at Stanford or in Seattle, et cetera, we sat down immediately with the heads, the key health officials in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Nigeria, and talked to them, worked with them, what they saw as the solution. And the interesting story, and I think you heard it the last time we spoke, but the solution turned out to be, we've got to get this figured out, but we can't do it in a traditional, get pharmacists to pay for this, go give it to people, because otherwise it's not sustainable. So the health officials in Africa said, this is only doable if we can get this to less than 50 cents per dose. Well, this is, it seems pretty logical, but let me tell you, I've sat on vaccine company boards. We don't think about that way in the West when we develop drugs and vaccines. What we do is we do lots and lots and lots of research, and it's very legitimate and very hard and very high bar. And then we get that figured out. We take the cost of the research. We add some margin for, a lot of margin usually for profit. We divide it by some projected number of units, and that's the cost per unit. That's how we derive a cost in most of the world. This was taking a very different algorithm. This was saying, we're going to force the cost to be part of the target product profile, which in a scientific terms is quite unusual. And I think we're going to have to do this more in the world. But anyway, long story short, we did that. 10 years later, a vaccine was, and in fact, it was record-breaking in terms of how fast this got done. But we got a new vaccine for this strain, developed, manufactured, registered, and approved by the WHO and all the regulatory authorities, and including the FDA. And we started with UNICEF and WHO a campaign to immunize. And so we've had about 100, and I think what that says, I've understood about 150,000 people have been, 150 million people have been immunized. And we'll have 300 million people immunized with this by 2016. So, and none of them have reported any meningitis. So, this is about as good as it gets. When you have, say, how do I take a problem, I figure out a bunch of tough economic and scientific solutions and political solutions. I work with government, I work with the private sector, I work with NGOs, and I work with multilateral institutions. Solve it and take it to scale at the level of hundreds of millions of people's lives being saved. And so, this is obviously one we like to talk about, but it's more an example of our model, which is to work across all these different pieces. So let me spend about 3 more minutes to tell you what PATH does, and then we'll turn to questions. So this just gives you a quick snapshot. In the corporate world, we wouldn't be very big, but in the nonprofit world, it's a pretty big place. A lot of employees around the world want to have a lot of technologies. You can read. I don't, but one of the fun and cool facts that has very little to do with me is many times we're ranked among the top 2 to 5 most effective nonprofits in the world. And the other thing we've done, we win all sorts of awards for that, including the awards from the Tech Museum. We basically do 5 things. We work on platforms. We have a service, well, let me go the other way. A vaccine platform that I mentioned. We develop vaccines where the market otherwise has failed, or we try to de-risk that vaccine development. We work on vaccine devices. We've developed ways. Another one of the big things we did is, well, this is a good entrepreneurial story. Whoops, we can use that one, I guess. One problem with vaccines when you have to do it in developing worlds is that you have to keep vaccines cold for the most part. So it's called the cold chain. It's a problem because you and I don't worry about it because we've got refrigerators that work 24/7 in our medical facilities. But if you're trying to reach a kid in rural DRC, to go from the manufacturer all the way to that village, the cold chain is likely to have been broken over and over. So the problem is even when we were able to have a vaccine and even figure out the supply chain to get it to that kid, often the kid was getting a bad vaccine because somewhere along the way, the vaccine had gotten heated up and died, but yet we didn't know it, so they were being injected with a bad vaccine. So it's almost it's the tragedy upon tragedies. Not only is he going to die of a vaccine-preventable death, but he got a vaccine, an immunization, but it was bad. So what one guy, a guy working for PATH, who was kind of a geek and looked at, he would go to your, what did you call it, the geek dating? Oh, very cool. But he was buying chicken for the family dinner about 15 years ago and noticed that on frozen chicken, I don't know how many of you know this, but you probably eat at the cafeteria, but on frozen chicken, that there's a little thing that if the chicken thaws out and then gets refrozen, it's not good for meat to be thawed out. So there's a little thing that if it does that, it changes color. And so you'll know that. And most of the time, what you don't know is the people that stock in the grocery store do that. Well, he started looking at that and thinking, well, that's interesting. There's some interesting technology there that gives me a signal whether something's gotten too heated. So he's, the guy that read Popular Mechanics a lot when he was 15, and we pay him now at 45 to, come up with clever ideas. He took that, and he went back and started thinking about that. So he calls up the company, found out who holds the IP on it, the patent, started working with it and adapted it with the permission of the company. And long story short, is came up with this little dot that basically if something gets too hot or too cold, it changes color. And now every single vial, which has a vaccine in it coming out of UNICEF for the development, it has that on it. And so we have had over 4.5 billion of these, what we call vaccine vial monitors, distributed around the world. So now if a healthcare worker sees the color change, they know that this isn't a good vaccine. So those are the kinds of things we do in vaccines. We also help with development. We have a drug development group working on new drugs here in the Bay Area, actually. They're in South San Francisco. That's where I was this morning. Particularly on diarrheal disease. We focus a lot on diarrheal disease. And why do we focus on diarrhea? Because it's great to tell stories at cocktail parties, and it's also nothing like sitting with a bunch of high-end rich donors and saying, we're going to talk about poop. But it's also the number 2 killer of kids in the world. What we forget is that we think that HIV and TB, and these are horrible diseases, but actually the most kids in the world die unnecessarily of respiratory disease and pneumonia and diarrhea. And malaria is number 3rd. So we have some drug ideas. We do a lot on safe water. We're working on vaccines for diarrhea. We also do a lot of work on diagnostics, self-explanatory, a variety of devices. I mentioned the monitor. We do a lot of cold chain devices. We do interesting ways so you can, when injecting a medicine or a vaccine, often the problem is that it takes a skilled nurse or trained professional to fill the syringe and saying, how can we solve for that problem? Because what it means is you only got a limited number of nurses and doctors, you can't get to scale. So how do you, what we call task shift, how do you shift the task to a lower level worker to enable better and broader health care? But the thing you have to do is make the devices simpler. So came up with this really cool little device which you can pre-fill. It's called Uniject, and all you have to do is do this and squeeze, and you've got your vaccine or your drug. So we're working on those kinds of devices. And finally, we work a lot on systems and services. We recognize that vaccines don't deliver themselves, that you can't just develop technology and throw it over the fence. You have to think about how to create the advocacy to make sure that we get the regulatory environment right, how to create the demand, so a lot of behavior change and demand creation. How do you design the systems? So we work a lot on those as well. And then we don't do everything everywhere. What we mainly do is work in the middle of the value chain over here. We are not a basic research office. We do a lot of work, partner with industry, a lot of interesting labs and a lot of academic labs here at Stanford. We work a lot with Stanford innovation coming out of your research shop. And then we also typically don't do too much at the far end. We leave that full scale-up activity to others. We design it, we make it, we enable it, but then we hand it off to governments or UNICEF or people or NGOs or social entrepreneurs or businesses to get it to scale generally. That most of what we work on is in that sort of hard to do middle of the value chain. And so then, you start looking, and I won't go through this, but so you take that framework of 5 platforms, middle of the value chain, and then you start playing with, it's a Rubik's Cube at some point. That's my job, is to every day think about that Rubik's Cube. Where are we prioritizing against what country, against what part of the value chain, in what disease area? The problem in a management role, if those of you are interested in management in this work, is there's no bad decision because, well, there are bad decisions, but there's not there are few decisions that I make that won't save somebody's life. The question is, are we being smart about how much impact we can have with those resources and how to make those choices? So those are some of the challenges. I guess I should just leave this one other idea, which is a very cool one, which I think is one of these other areas that we talk about 21st century problems, and it happened right here in the Bay Area. Actually, it was a Berkeley idea, not a Stanford idea. So malaria, number 3 killer. I don't know, many of you know, I come from countries where malaria is just devastating, and we have a lot of work we can do. We actually are advancing a malaria vaccine. We have bed nets. We have other things, but still it's a really debilitating and deathly disease. One of the major drugs to treat malaria is a drug called artemisinin. It's developed out of a natural product, a wormwood. Problem with a natural wormwood product is it has an unstable supply. So there are times when there's too much and times when there's too little, and then in a drought really affects the global supply. So what happens is here you have number 3 killer of people in the world, one of the worst diseases. No vaccine yet, so our main way is either preventing it using bed nets and things like that, mosquito bites, which causes malaria, or you treat it, and our main treatment is dependent on this very fluctuating market of natural products. So what we did is worked with Berkeley and a company here in the Bay Area and developed in partnership a semi-synthetic artemisinin, which we're actually not trying to displace the natural producers, but create a global reservoir. So we have in reserve enough that it will help stabilize the market price for that over a period of time, which will really save a lot of lives. So a very cool thing. It just went to scale this year. It's one of the 5 or 6 big wins we've had this year, and now Sanofi and others are taking it to industrial production. So that's a little bit about, I won't go through, we have a whole bunch of new strategies and vision, but you don't need to hear about that. So, it's a cool thing to do. I think for me, it's pulling this back together. It's become a way to take some of these lessons that I've learned from these different parts of my journey, work with a phenomenal team of all sorts of people, scientists, business people, data modelers, statisticians, public health experts, both, so about half of people in PATH work outside of the United States and Europe, so a lot of capacity. We have 25 offices around the world in country, and tackle tough social problems. But we do it by sort of looking at every problem through the lens of this is not going to be done by any single group alone. And I think that if there's any lesson, I would say that's the lesson that I would want to impress, is that most solutions are going to happen through very deep and complex cross-sector collaboration. So that's all I have to say. I'm happy to answer questions, chat about any topic or whatever. Yeah, that'd be great. Remember, I'm a law school professor, so I can get Socratic if you aren't careful. So you have to ask me questions, or I will.
If you have known that you're going to be working as a CEO of a global health company, would you go to medical school, law school, or business school?
See, you didn't listen. I said I would never give anybody career advice because I don't know. I mean, I don't think you should aspire to be the CEO of a global health organization. It's one of those things that you build enough experience in it, there's a fit or not. I think to say I want to have a big impact in global health, and if you're inclined to think about the medical, the science and medical issues, that's where we need a lot of help. That we have really, really tough scientific and technological problems that we need the smartest people in the world to help solve. The fact is, though, there's sort of been a myth that you have to be a doctor to do this work. And in fact, it's probably been a limiting factor in the sector. And I think what's interesting now, it's part of the conversation we're having, I think we're recognizing better that, in fact, people like me who know nothing but can come in and, some people with different I have no real technical or scientific chops. But, it doesn't mean I can't help work with those kind of folks and help design and help build the capacity and help manage and make smart decisions around those. So I think it really, I think the only answer is play to your interest and strengths. And that's, it's, if you feel like, where your best talents are managing and building bridges and problem solving and strategy, which would probably be in my toolkit, then probably business, law, those are good degrees for that. If you're really, your mind is one that can tackle tough technological problems, there's lots of other programs. Yeah.
Have you found that those could be a barrier trying to lead people who are kind of interested in the health sphere? Has it kind of discredited you in any way to not kind of be formally educated in those spheres?
I'm probably the wrong person to ask, right? Oh God, here comes the idiot again. No, but I don't think so. So I've done this in a couple different instances. So I ran an internet company, and I could no more tell you the first thing about coding. But I think there are two or three things that you have to do then. One is you have to know what you don't know, and be sure you build a lot of capacity and deference to that, because I'm not here to second guess, but I do know how to ask hard questions to see if I can. You do need to build in some checks and balances then. Okay, so then I'm going to make sure that I don't just get that technical advice from one person, but I have to balance it against others, which I actually think might even make that a better model rather than believing you have all the answers. And the third is I do know how to dummy down this stuff down. And my own experience is that's really useful. It's when I was a technology or an IP lawyer, I used to drive software guys crazy. I would sit there and go, okay, say it again for me. And then they'd say, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now you got to say it again for me because I don't understand it. And the point I was making then was if I didn't understand it, I wasn't going to be able to write a contract that would have made sense. This was back in my law days. But more importantly, and the only reason you have a contract is generally that if there's a problem, a judge will have to read it, or one of the reasons. And if I didn't understand it, the judge isn't going to understand it, and then you're really screwed. So get it so it's understandable to me, and nothing can be that. And so clearly there's highly technical things that I never aspire to do, but most often they're pretty core narratives here that you can work with, and I try to do that and pursue them. And I study hard too. I still read a lot. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I think, that would probably be very contextual depending on, am I making a budget decision or are we making a strategy decision or am I making a political decision? These are, at any given day as a CEO of a large organization, and this was true when I was on the corporate side and certainly when I've been running, I've been the chair of a number of big boards. You make different types of qualitative and quantitative types of decisions. But I think my main thing is 3 or 4 lessons there. One is you really do need to do your homework. And you need to plan for it. I do see a lot of people who start moving as fast as, we all do, and with 17 different gadgets and a lot of big responsibilities, and you can see people making too many of them on the fly. And so I have a really tough decision to make this week about a particular situation, and so I'm flying in the morning to DC for some things, and I've just, and I'm going to take 6 hours tomorrow on that airplane, and I just got to nail it. I got to do the research. I brought all the documents with me. I mean, so there are times when I know that I really have to, kind of dig deep, do the homework, et cetera. But, and then certainly making sure, that you've got a pretty good group of advisors around you, external or internal, that you can not necessarily defer to, but at least get some judgment call. Am I crazy? Does this sound right to you? And then finally, trust your gut. And I would say over and over again, particularly on personnel decisions, which is probably the number one thing I decide, the most important thing I decide. And Sergey Brin would tell you this, I will tell you this, Bill Gates would tell you this. That is the biggest decision you make in a leadership role, is who do you hire, who do you fire, who do you advance, who do you not advance, who do you trust, who do you not trust, and there you've got to do your homework and all that as well, but at the end of the day, there's a certain level of gut. And I have to say, where I've blown it is when my gut told me one thing, I did the other, and 6 months later, I'm unwinding it because I didn't trust my gut. So, yeah.
I'm curious, I come from China. I'm really interested. You have great interest in China, and also past is much in China side. So my question is, what is the typical or Stanford's past made in China in the past years? Another concern question of what do you think of the nonprofit development in China?
Yeah, well, let me take the two. So the first question is, what about nonprofit development in China? And then what are some of the big challenges or opportunities in China with PATH? Is that was the? Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, it really is interesting to see China and some other countries, the sort of evolving nature of the social sector, and particularly, for a long time there was really no legitimate social sector or civil society allowed, other than highly controlled, what were called gongos, the government-organized NGO. And that's really changed, as I'm sure you know, with a lot more proliferation of smaller organizations, albeit not with all the. Not without constraints. There are lots of things that are there limits and issues, but I've actually I'm quite engaged and positive on this. I think we've seen the Minister of Civil Affairs take some real important steps, particularly coming out of the earthquake and a few other things where we've seen the ability to organize and to do some self-organizing, which has been a really important step. There's a emerging regulatory landscape in China, or regulatory would be the word, about how do you register and what are the opportunities for both philanthropic foundations and NGOs and social entrepreneurs, so they actually think of that in a more interesting way. The other area I just mentioned is HIV in China, which I worked on a lot. It's interesting. So, China doesn't have a very broad epidemic, but it has in big urban areas a lot of HIV concentrated in Chongqing and a few big cities. Primarily, the demographics are a lot of sex workers. Some of the more sort of traditional demographics, a lot, although it's spread out. But what had happened is, for a long time, the way that they were addressing the disease was to have sex workers or men who have sex with men go to the Public Security Bureau to get their condoms, for instance. It's like, really? But it was sort of this mentality that this was a public security problem, and we're going to do enlightened work by distributing free condoms, but we're going to have you come to the PSB, really, and so that wasn't a workable model, right? And so really it was through that angle that then civil society started coming forward and saying grassroots organizations have much better reach. They know how to reach these communities. They know how to create demand for these communities, educate and create demands. They are safe, So then the government had to acknowledge that. The Ministry of Health said, yeah, we do need to open up this to civil society. So it was very interesting kind of Trojan horse thing, where that became the reason that the government started saying we needed to allow more civil society into AIDS prevention, and then we needed to set up the regulations of them, et cetera. So, and that's enlarged. So there's lots of civil society working on those issues now in China. So I think generally it's a good positive, albeit it's never going to look like civil society does here or in other countries. One of the big things I would say, 5 or 6 big wins that PATH has made in the last year, one of them has to do with China. Another vaccine story, and I'll be quick, but the Japanese encephalitis, a very bad disease again that kills and maims a lot of kids in Asia. We don't get it. Rich kids around the world don't get it, but poor kids do in Asia, and it maims and kills. We've been trying to solve for that for a number of years. The Chinese actually have a very high quality, low cost Japanese encephalitis vaccine that is available inside China, but it was never available outside China. We, over the years, have occasionally gotten WHO to go in, and we've worked very closely with the manufacturer to raise the quality standards. So WHO would have a waiver, so allowed at one point 75 million kids in India to get in a campaign when it was an outbreak of JE. But for the most part, it's been restricted. But just this year, we actually, after 10 years of work, got WHO to pre-qualify this manufacturer in China, and in Chengdu, so this is a big deal, and it sounds pretty geeky, but I'll tell you why it's a big deal. First of all, we're going to save a lot of lives, because we now have a vaccine that's about 1/10 of the cost of the other vaccines. So if you're going to address equity, health equity, cost is the critical factor. You got to get it cheap, close to zero as you can. And so this will help. We'll save lots of lives. But it's also cool because it's the first time there's ever been a Chinese vaccine regulated and approved for the global public market. And so a big step forward. And what's exciting is we think there will be more, and there should be. I mean, there's lots of high quality. There's a regulatory environment we have to work with, and we have to make sure that quality stays high, but high quality. The third is it actually has a nice macroeconomic piece, because for the most part, the vaccines for the poor in the world are made by the Indians, and that's now we have competition. And competition is usually good for price, and that's what I want, is cheaper vaccines for kids. So this will help set up a macroeconomic dynamic that we look forward to. And then the final piece about this story is that it's an interesting collaboration. So often, China is taking steps to engage more in the broader world issues about global health and development, but has typically, particularly in Africa, done a lot of it alone without a lot of collaboration with other countries. But this is a great example of a very deep multi-sector, multi-country collaboration that many different people were involved in. So that's actually really good too. Yes, ma'am. Sure. So the first is, where do we end up working? And I wish I could say there was some wonderful design and sort of really highly rational approach. We're trying to rationalize it more, but fundamentally, a lot of organizations, including my experience, for-profit organizations, end up starting by somebody, either you in the corporate or for-profit world, you get a customer or a client or somebody, and you get the project, and you end up going there, and then one thing leads to another. In our world, you get some funder to say, we need you to do this work in blank, and suddenly you find yourself living the Ghanan dream, right? I mean, you go from one place. What we've now done is we're trying to rationalize that around, with the scale of the activity we have and the number of, where are the greatest needs? It's our first and foremost criteria. So we look at places that are, the both the health indicators are some of the worst, and some of the places where we believe, though, that there's at least some advance or opportunity to bring innovation in. Some places are so systemically kind of challenged that we are not a relief organization. So in a real conflict zone or post-conflict, like we wouldn't go into Syria today. There's nothing. We have a lot of partners that do that, but we're not what we do is we'd go into Syria, or like we went into Haiti after the earthquake, to start looking at more systemic introductions of products or solutions. But we're clear that we don't do direct relief. So sometimes that informs, what countries. And then there's a variety of other factors we're looking at: leadership, political will, things that would make a difference. But again, a lot of it is funder driven. But we're actually rationalizing that with certain platform countries. There's a little bit of a challenge in this world that as people push for more and more measurement and metrics and show, proof of impact, which is a good thing generally. There's a lot more pressure to demonstrate impact. The only bad part about that, well, there are many bad parts about that. There are challenges with it. There's good and bad. Is that sometimes the tail wags the dog a lot in this world because of that. The demand for data means we've turned down proposals from foundations where they're going to spend more money on the data than they were on the work, and I think that's out of sync. But the other bad part is a lot of times they're focusing on countries with lots of zeros. So in order to really move the needle on global health indicators, you got to go to Nigeria, you got to go to Ethiopia, you got to go to Bihar and Uttar Pradesh in northern India. There's this group of countries that are big populations, and those, if you can make a 2 or 3 or 4% dent, that's going to be a bigger shift than if you go to 8 small countries. I don't like that idea. So we've really tried to choose to say we're not going to get totally sucked into that. So we have capacity in the Senegals of the world and the Burkina Fasos, but we know that Nigeria is where a lot of funders will go because there's so many people, and need. So that's a bit of a tricky one on working in this area. The engagement with government is tricky. Is also tricky. It's all like everything in life, right? There's a polarity and a dual view. We mainly work with ministers of health and ministers of science and technology because that's fundamentally our customer and the work we do. In most places in the world, health is a national mandate. We lose sight of that. Sometimes we Americans, and I know not very few probably in the room are actually Americans, but where America has gone a long way from health being a national mandate. But in most countries, it's part of the constitutional mandate, or it's a central government mandate, or federalized government mandate to support health and well-being of people. So in many sense, you cannot do a lot with health without engagement of the ministers of health, and nor should you, because it's their work. So we clearly work very closely, and we're seen as a good technical partner. So we don't come in to solve their problems. We're not sitting there to tell them what to do, but we're like, what evidence can we bring to bear on the problem? What kind of tools could you consider for that problem? What kind of introduction of system redesign should you consider? Can we be we're trying to be a technical partner, and that's sort of our unique niche. It does, in many instances, slow us down. And that's the downside, right? So you get entrenched in yet another bureaucracy. You've got politics at work. I mean, these ministers of health are subject to are typically one of the weaker ministries in most countries. If you kind of look at the pecking order of departments, and yet they're highly influential. So we're that's a tough needle to thread. So you've got to work with them. But you've got to also figure out to what degree can you work around them or parallel to them. Now, that's one of the reasons why we work not only directly with governments, but as I showed you that chart where on scale up, we also tend to work a lot with other NGOs who actually might have a lot more capacity and feet on the ground than we do. So, which is typical. We don't have a lot of feet. We're not in a big implementation kind of organization. So, where they already have access to communities, they're usually mainly of the community. I mean, most of these NGOs I talk about are not expats coming into country. These are community-based organizations, authentically. And so we will work with them, and they usually have a way to work through government. And we're also use a lot of private sector channels. So some of these tools and devices, vaccines, you have to go through government. That's a government. But drugs, condoms, diagnostics, a lot of things like that, you can go through the private sector. And so we will try to engage private sector. And that's another way to work alongside of the ministry. I mean, you still have to have their approval, but you don't have to have them drive the process. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Yeah.
So you mentioned that Pat didn't spend any money on marketing, and now we are starting marketing. Also, though, you mentioned how like the person in the World Health Organization like Pat not taking any credit. So in your new marketing effort, what will be your marketing strategy? What will be kind of the corporate brand you are planning for Pat, and how are you going to manage that credit issue?
Well, you know, I heard you're kind of a rock star, so you can come on board and figure that out for me, okay? I don't, that's a tough question. It's, we got to find a balance. So we've got to find a balance that we're working on to have a clear story, a clear narrative, a more, you know, kind of, and part of this isn't so much that we don't really, I mean, it's not about, the end here is not at all about, you know, glory or fame. I mean, we wouldn't be in this work if that was what we're trying to do. The end is so that you don't have to spend so much of your time getting through the door, just trying to explain yourself, so people, you know, will know if I call up and say, insiders in Geneva would know, you know, I'm from PATH, I need this, but, you know, we don't want to have that sort of be a barrier to our work and our access. And but we also believe that it will help build more partnerships. So I just came from a meeting of a lot of top sort of movers and shakers from the Valley, where we hosted a nice lunch today. And, you know, we're trying to get more people engaged in our work now that we have a San Francisco presence. But the big issue there was partnerships. So there's a lot of interesting technology innovation, a lot of different academic involvement. And so some of it is around that. And then the final is, of course, that we're, you know, unapologetic about the fact that, you know, the more money we can raise, particularly unrestricted money, the better impact we can have, because most big grant makers, like the federal government or the Gates Foundation or the Norwegian government or places that we get money, they typically aren't early stage risk takers. They are at a scale that they first of all, they only give big grants because they can't manage. So some of the most interesting innovation is sometimes built on the back of a $15,000 or $20,000 or $30,000, you know, piece that we could just adapt this. If we just had $50,000 to translate it to that, we could actually make a big difference. But the Gates Foundation isn't going to give us $50,000, so we got to raise money to support that kind of work. So we're going to try to take a, you know, clarifying the story, doing a little bit. We're not going to take a. We're not also try to go retail. We're not going to try to compete frontline with, you know, retail. You know, you won't see PATH on the street corner. You won't see PATH with a whole bunch of glossy brochures. But, you know, we want to make sure we're, I'm now tweeting, you know, that we're trying to engage in a number of ways to get our message and our innovation brand out there. But it's a work in progress. I don't have, I mean, if the person that was running that group for us probably could be very articulate about, you know, the 5 drivers and the 4 constraints, et cetera. But it's, in my view, we got to do more. We got to have it simpler, but we can't do it. We can't overdo it. There's a sort of scientific integrity or scientific culture a little bit around our work, where our technical people are quite clear they don't want us to oversell ourselves, that they feel very strongly that they do this work, often having chosen to give up more lucrative careers elsewhere, because a lot of the people at PATH are PhD, MD, super, you know, from top universities around the world that have chosen this path to make sure that, but they don't feel like they want it to, they want us to be careful that we're not overselling ourselves. So we have to listen to that. Yes, ma'am.
Speaking of building partnerships and opening doors, how did PATH first get started? Like when nobody really knew like exactly what you guys were doing, and what were the first steps that you took to build those first partnerships?
Yeah, well, it was, you know, it was even before my time, which is saying it was a long, long time ago. But it was in the 70s when I was in high school. But and my understanding, and actually interesting enough, the 3 founders are still alive, although all in their mid to late 80s. And I've spent some time with these incredible people, but they did what people do here, right? They did what you guys are doing. They looked at a problem and they said, look, there's a vacuum. That this is that we're beginning to see. This was a period in which there was a lot of I think would be a lot less than today, but a lot of activity around family planning and reproductive health is a critical need. But they saw that there was a gap between the rhetoric and the politics and the actual tools. So they said, we need to improve the tools. We need to come in and improve quantum quality, and we need to make things reliable, et cetera. And there's a real technology to this, and there's a real, and then they went on to say there's other devices, and then there's other diseases, and we can take this and move it forward. And so I think it started pretty much, with the funding mainly of the federal government, because the USAID was interested in this, and they started building the backbone with one grant and a few partnerships in a couple countries. And and then it and the rest is history in some ways. I think there were a number of critical, dimensions. Number one, PATH always felt very strongly, which is I think one of the reasons it's had some of the branding problems it has. It also has a horrible name, but we're not going to change it. I mean, it doesn't have a most compelling brand, but I forgot what I was going to say. I know. One of PATH's big challenges is that the governance of PATH has always been viewed to be very much rather than building a big sort of high-profile U.S. board. So if you look at a lot of the NGOs that we work a lot with, they're about our scale or bigger, but kind of in the same category. Like CARE or Save the Children, something. They are mainly big now U.S. boards with a lot of wealthy people or influential people with a couple of people from other countries. PATH actually started from the very opposite governance-wise. They said the majority of the board needed to be from countries we served, and only one or two people should come from the United States to reflect kind of the genuine, politics of what we're trying to do. This should be about, serving and helping and assisting, not driving an agenda into another country. So I think that was a good thing, and I certainly enjoyed being on that one of those couple of Americans on that board when I was on the board. It actually has a double, the backside of that is we never did many fundraising. These are brilliant, usually public health experts, but they weren't thinking about marketing. They were thinking about what are the issues of reproductive health in Bangladesh, and they might have been the smartest people in the world around that. But so we it has its ups and downs. So I think over time we recognize that we need to build out that in other ways. The other big game changer here, and there's no question it was for PATH, and is when Bill Gates' dad in the late 1990s said, son, and I was part of that group of his friends saying, Bill, you got to do something more with your money. You can't wait till you retire. And Bill's dad, whose also name is Bill, said, I heard that there was a meeting at PATH, and he sat down and learned a lot about global health, and he went back and told Bill and Melinda and said, there's a lot going on right down the street here that you should start learning about. And so actually got together and hosted a dinner, and then there was other dinners and meetings, and therefore it turns out that sort of engagement with PATH helped Bill think about global health at the level that he's subsequently thought about. And the connection between PATH and Gates Foundation is complicated. It's large. They fund about 50% of what we do. But that's been another game changer for PATH, is because we were working on a lot of the same things that Bill cared about, and then it kind of sort of symbiotically. So then that escalated PATH. So PATH then went from $50, $60 million, which is still big. That's a very big nonprofit. I mean, by nonprofit terms, but suddenly to several hundred million in a few years because of the Gates Foundation. Yeah.
One more question. How will the conversation go when you sit
Well, I mean, first of all, I do this all the time. So I'm going to be in Africa for the next 3 weeks, and I will sit with the health minister in the Democratic DRC. I will do it in Kenya. I will sit with the health minister, and I also like to sit with other ministers of finance, ministers of science and technology in Ethiopia and in Zambia. And the conversation will generally be, they're actually know more about us than most people here do. So we've got a presence. We've driven some pretty successful projects in those countries. So they look to, and so getting into that door is not a hard problem to solve. The challenge we always have is sort of the understanding, and I get a lot of briefing and stuff, but it's the politics of that particular situation. Is this a weak minister or a strong minister? Are they, is the prime minister or whoever, the president or whoever engaged? Where is USAID on this? Where is the Gates Foundation? Where is the British government on this? Because it's this mix of funders, multiple governments, multiple players, and then other large NGOs that are critical. So once I understand that, usually the conversation is, what are the 4 or 5 largest problems they're trying to tackle in our area, right? I mean, we are clearly about health broadly, but still health. So, I don't go in and talk about their school system, which is often, one of the biggest things they're trying to solve too. I did that when I was at McKinsey, but not anymore. And then, what are the analytics that we might be able to help them or their particular group with to understand that problem better. So often, what you find is that we are still making too many of these decisions, and particularly at the country level, without the data that you need to understand it or to understand the drivers. So we often start with the conversation about data and evidence. We don't come in with data and evidence and say, hey, it's more about what are you guys seeing, what are the gaps, what are things. Sometimes we can help with that. So sometimes we can come back and say, well, we know where there is, or we've done some work, or we know who did some work in that area. Sometimes we have to say, well, maybe we should go get some data, or somebody should go do a test. And then usually it's a little bit of but here's some solutions. So classic example. In the last 10 years, we've made and I've got the numbers, but I won't bore you, the big impact in the last 10 to 15 years on child mortality. So, there was in in the year 2000, the United Nations issued a set of Millennium Development Goals, which I'm hoping you all know about. If you aren't, then you should go back to square one and start this class with that, because Millennium Development Goals are important not only because of the global community's commitment to them, but they've actually been more effective than anyone would have guessed at setting up a framework and also creating a bit of a weird sort of almost competition-like thing. I was in a meeting with the Secretary General of the United Nations and head of the World Bank and a bunch of heads of state, and it was weird almost, like, because, well, I've gotten my MDG 5 and you have, but it's very important. But what has happened is we've done better on MGD 4 so there's several related to health, and the two, including one on HIV, but MDG 4 is about children's mortality. We've actually seen quite a bit of progress, and we've got a lot more work to do. We've isolated the problem more. We understand that it's actually the first 30 days are some of the most critical issues. If we could start resolving things going on in the first 30 days, and you also have to understand the evidence is absolute and overwhelming that the more you can affect the more you can create healthy families, the smaller family sizes that will result. So part of you want to do is have healthier families, higher levels of child health, and that will have it's called the demographic dividend. That will automatically, and we've seen this in every culture in every part of the world, that will bring down birth rates. So it actually has a nice compounding effect. The problem we have is we have a lot to work to do on MDG 4, but MDG 5 is where maternal mortality, that has not moved very much. So what we're seeing is while we've done a lot to save children's lives, we still have a lot more to go. Moms are still suffering horribly, and we haven't looked at the right kind of interventions. And you can guess a lot of the cultural and political dynamics of this, why mothers aren't getting the attention. They're often denied any kind of power or role in their community or their families. And so there's huge social dimensions of this, but we need to work on that one. Now, we're not working on it with an agenda to say, we're going to tell you what to do, but we're saying, how are you addressing maternal mortality? Is this a result of postpartum hemorrhage? What kind of tools do you use in postpartum hemorrhage? Is this, are they too costly? Can we've developed some very cheap ways to get postpartum hemorrhage tools to clinics? Can we help you in that? So that's the kind of conversation. What are the problems you're trying to solve? What are the solutions? What evidence do you have? What kind of data do you need? What kind of policy environment would be helpful to bring that tool, and what kind of collaboration do we do with who are the private sector and public sector and NGO sector players, and then how can we help you? That's pretty much the last question. How can I help you? Thanks.